You know, the congregation is so chatty on Sunday mornings. It's only Wednesdays that you are 3 minutes early being like, where's Nick? If you want to say a verse cards are going to pass out. We're going to start in the back this time. Take one, pass it around if you want to. So tight on my neck, man. Percy wants me to do another one, but okay, so on Wednesday nights this quarter, we're doing lessons from the life of Moses, and we're doing a little bit, I guess, of a roundabout class because we're not going to be talking as much about Moses in this class as we're going to be talking about Pharaoh, because I was looking at the plagues. At this point in the life of Moses, he was born, he was saved, he left Egypt, he was called, now he's coming back to Egypt, and he's interacting with Pharaoh. And I wanted to look at the 10 plagues and do something from the 10 plagues that wasn't just a recitation of what they were, or wasn't just a breakdown of the things that we've studied a million times. And so although we are in lessons from the life of Moses, we're going to hone in specifically on Pharaoh's hard heart and talk about what that means, the implications it has for our current lives. So the first question I have for us is, what is a hard heart? And I'm going to throw it open to y'all to talk about what is your definition of a hard heart. Before I ask you what you think of when you think of a hard heart, I'm going to read this quote I found on the internet from a book I didn't read, but it was an article that quoted this book, so I just took the book quote, but I thought it was interesting. It says, "Now by a hard heart is plainly meant an unaffected heart, or a heart not easy to be moved with virtuous affections, like a stone, insensible, stupid, unmoved, and hard to be impressed." I love the idea of a hard heart being a stone heart that's not really penetrable. But in your own lives, when you think of a hard heart, or you think of someone with a hard heart, what do you typically think of?
I would say like stubborn. That's kind of the first word I think that comes to mind is I feel like when I think of a hard heart, it's almost intentional. Like you are willfully not doing what's right.
I like the term unmoving that's used here, and I think it's kind of the same thing where it's like there's these things trying to penetrate your heart, but you're stubborn, you're not letting it impact you the way it probably should. What other thoughts do we have?
Not humble.
Yeah, definitely.
Just, not humble. I don't want to admit that you're human, make mistakes, and you could be wrong.
Yeah, if we're going to do the inverse, having a soft heart is maybe someone that is very moved by things and maybe a little bit more emotional, someone that is more humble and willing to help others. So if you have a hard heart, you're not moved by those things, and you're maybe a little bit more boastful, a little bit more kind of clinging to your own things and not willing to give or be generous. Any other thoughts? So this is our text for tonight. Actually, before we get there, let's read Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Forgot I had that up there. Who has Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6? Perfect.
Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." And then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. And he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus.
Thank you. I think I wanted to start class with this verse specifically because I think it paints a really good picture of what it looks like when Jesus is getting upset with someone for their hardness of heart. Jesus is in the synagogue and he sees a man with a withered hand. And you don't really have to go into waxing poetic about what it might be like for this person with a withered hand. But needless to say, Jesus had sympathy and he had love for this person. And he wanted to heal this person and take away their burdens, take away the things that this person was struggling with. And the Pharisees opposed this. And they were angry about this. And Jesus looks at them and he is frustrated by their hardness of heart, is what my ESV version says in verse 5. He looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and he immediately heals the person. So I love that picture of Jesus as someone with a soft heart, and these Pharisees are someone with a hard heart. You see a very clear distinction of the empathy that comes when you have a soft heart, and the stubbornness and the legality that comes when you cling to your hard heart. So this is what I was trying to get at. This is technically our text for tonight, and we're going to read some of these, but certainly not all of them. And when we see the hardness of heart in this story specifically, we see two different types of hard hearts. One, we see where Pharaoh hardens his own heart, or it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And one where we see God specifically hardens Pharaoh's heart. And we're going to talk about the nuances and differences between those. Before we get into that, though, does anyone have any thoughts or comments on why we think it is that in some verses it talks about Pharaoh hardening his heart, in some verses it talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Perfect. Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. So the first point I want to make is that sometimes we harden our own hearts in rebellion to God, in rebellion to what we think is right. And that's going to be the verses talking about Pharaoh hardening his own heart. So who has Exodus chapter 7, verses 8 through 13? Let's go ahead and turn there. Exodus chapter 7, verses 8 through 13.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, and Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said.
Thank you. Who has Exodus chapter 8, verses 8 through 15?
Then Pharaoh called to Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, and they be sacrificed to the Lord. And Moses said to Pharaoh, accept the honor of saying what I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your houses, that they may remain in the river only. So he said, tomorrow, and he said, let it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, and from your people. They shall remain in the river only. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried out to the Lord concerning the frogs, which he had brought against Pharaoh. So the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, out of the courtyards, and out of the fields. They gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But then Pharaoh saw that there was relief. He hardened his heart, and he did not heed as the Lord had said.
Thank you. So we have these two different stories here. One where Moses and Aaron approach Pharaoh and they perform this miracle, and this is a miracle that clearly proves that God is in control. The staff turns into serpents. The serpents swallow up the Egyptian serpents, and God shows his dominance. And yet Pharaoh sees this miracle in front of his eyes, and it says his heart was hardened. And in the second story, there's the second plague, which is frogs, and Pharaoh pleads with Moses and asks for the plague to subside. And the plague does subside, and after it subsides, in verse 14, they gathered them together into heaps, and the land stank. In verse 15, Pharaoh saw that there was a respite. He hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So the question I pose to you all, in these two verses, but also just in general, why did Pharaoh harden his heart? Why did Pharaoh choose to harden his heart?
I think somebody already said the word stubborn. That's just the word that I keep trying to think of a way to describe it without using the word stubborn, and I can't think of it. But in both of these examples, I think the great picture of a hard heart is the person who sees, like they see and they hear, and it's right there, and there's nothing in the universe that will cause them to stop. It's just like the stubborn. It's just a stubbornness, an overwhelming stubbornness. And this is the passage. Do you have 14 later? I don't want to get ahead of you.
What verse?
14.
Exodus 14?
14 in verse 5.
No, I don't have that one.
In verse 5, this one's also on my list of hardened in heart. It's when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed. So the idea of the hard heart is somebody who says, I will not change my mind. It doesn't matter what I see or what happens. This is it. That's the picture to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that.
Sometimes I think, like when I harden myself to sin, maybe I hear something in a sermon or read something, and then when you read it the first time, your heart's convicted, and then you're kind of like, oh, but something is not going to do this, and then you forget about it. And I wonder the number of opportunities Pharaoh had with the different plagues and the different encounters he had with Moses. He had like a moment where his heart was convicted, maybe his conscience, that's something he should have changed, and he chose not to. And that process actually was what was hardening his heart, was his choice to not, kind of like what I'm trying to say, humble himself, but not choose to change things or act upon what his conscience or heart is telling him.
Mhm. Exodus 8, verse 8, it says, Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. That shows to me the conviction that you're talking about. I don't know how genuine that conviction is, but I feel like I've been there as that person where I'm going through something that's really hard and difficult, and I feel that convicted, and I say to the Lord, please take this burden away from me. And yet as soon as that burden goes and I feel the respite in verse 14, my heart gets hardened again. So I definitely hear that. I see tons of hands. Thank you for that. I saw Ian's hand first.
I think in my own mind that when Pharaoh's heart was hardened, he wasn't thinking about other people. He was thinking about himself and he was being like, what can I get out of this?
Yeah. Hand over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna think about putting myself in Pharaoh's shoes. There's an element of pride, especially in somebody in that position that is in front of others, that they're supposed to be leading and be empowered over, and there's an element of submission that he's very resistant to here. And I think whether it's a pause in a respite, that he finally regroups himself and is like, I'm not going to lose this. I'm going to show him authority as a Pharaoh. But it really, to me, boils down to pride. He's exhibiting.
I like what you said about refusing to submit or having like an aspect of submission, because that to me goes with the first one, which is he sees the superiority and the power of God greater than his own magicians and his own power. And what a beautiful moment for Pharaoh to say, wow, there's a higher power than me. But instead he hardens his heart, he refuses to submit. And even though he's faced with evidence that he's not in control, that he's not all powerful, he just has that hard heart, and so he refuses to give in. I saw other hands over here.
I think I'm remembering this right, but in that time, the Egyptian culture believed that Pharaoh was a god, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was part of their huge culture. especially when you are considered one of the gods. So like that previous comment that Chad just had about submitting, or the refusal to submit, is you're basically admitting like, yeah, I'm phony. This God is more powerful than I am. And so like, I kind of see why you would harden it to defend yourself.
Yeah. I love your comment because I thought about the fact of, you're saying Moses challenged Pharaoh's worldview, his entire worldview about the way he views things. And I think, how often does the gospel challenge our own worldview about how we view our own lives and how we view things? I know personally, when I became a Christian, there are plenty of moments where it's like just the fundamental way of which I view the world or interact with people is now different because of the gospel and because I became a Christian. So just as God is making us transform and change back in the time of Egypt, he's also calling us to be transformed, change, and have a different worldview now. So I think that's great. Is it Dave? Is he here?
Us seeing these plagues is more of an inconvenience to him. When the Nile turned to blood, he made them dig wells. So after that, things were happening that were taking them away from their work. So he interceded with asking Moses to remove things like that. And then at the end, the last child being, or the firstborn being killed, when you think he'd be at the bottom of the barrel and just finally soften, instead he again hardens and seeks out to gain them back after they've been released.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's a big inconvenience for him to obey, and going along with what Sarah was saying, it's inconvenient to look inwardly at our sin when it challenges our worldview or what we've always done. But then the text says it so clearly.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I was thinking about how he might be resistant to letting the Israelites go, just kind of practically. If he let an entire nation of slaves go, who's going to do the work that he wants for his kingdom? Like, just practically, the projects would stop. That might be something he was thinking about. Or what others would think about him, either in his circle or the other nations around him, saying, okay, a slave told you to let the slaves go, and you listen to him? What,
Yeah.
like his own political motives are at stake too. I don't know.
Yeah. I wonder if we can tie this in a little bit with the way Jesus defines hardness of heart with the man with the withered hand, where Jesus saw this person that was suffering and his heart was moved with compassion to do something about it. Meanwhile, the Pharisees just looked at him and were maybe afraid of how other Pharisees would perceive them, or how they would, set a new precedent or break a law. And it's the same thing, God looks at his people who are suffering and has compassion, and he was moved to help out his people. Meanwhile, Pharaoh looks out at the suffering of the people in his kingdom, even if they were slaves, and thinks of it more as, like you said, like a business expense. Oh, these projects need to get done. Just so hard of heart, he's not even moved with compassion. Absolutely.
Kind of an element of pride in the application of it is self-gratification. Pharaoh's case, or the Pharisees, people that want to be important, they want to be seen as important, they want to win the argument, they want to win the fight. And so they're proud, they stand, they stand there in opposition until they achieve their goal. Whether it's for themselves, it's not for anything else. Pharaoh wasn't trying to protect his people, better anybody. He wants what.
Amen. We're going to move on. There's a New Testament example for each of these points so that we can see it. This is not a principle that just, occurs in Exodus, but is a principle that permeates through the whole Bible. Let's go ahead and turn over and read Mark chapter 6, verse 52. Mark chapter 6, verse 52.
For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened.
Yeah, so this is the walking on the water example. And is it the disciples, it says, that sees this miracle happen right in front of them, and they didn't understand, and so their hearts were hardened a little bit. that's a interesting tie-in with what we just said, where it's, in this case, it's not necessarily enmity which forces them to harden their heart, but it's fear or confusion that forces them to harden their hearts. The ESV Study Bible has this to say: the heart refers to the whole of intellect, will, and emotions from which a person acts. The various Hebrew verbs used to describe the hardening of Pharaoh's heart all refer to a desire to act contrary to the Lord rather than in accord with him. I really love the first part of that paragraph, which says, when it says hardness of heart, it's not referring to the literal heart. When it says your heart, it's referring to your entire demeanor, intellect, will, emotions. So when you have a hard heart, it's not necessarily just an emotional thing. It's an entirety of your being, which is being confronted with something that God wants you to do, and you're putting up your hands and refusing to do that. I think that's really interesting. So the second point is, many times Pharaoh hardens his own heart, or his heart is hardened, and sometimes God hardens other people's hearts, and he hardens Pharaoh's heart to achieve his purpose. And this might be a confusing thing, but I think once we read some verses, we can see a very clear purpose here of why God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Let's look at Exodus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Who has that passage?
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord."
Thank you. And then Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 through 4.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." And they did so.
Thank you. So the question I pose to you all tonight is, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Why do we think God hardened Pharaoh's heart?
Used them to test Moses.
To test Moses? Can you expound on that a little bit more?
Well, I just remember speaking in a previous class about it seemed that God was using Pharaoh as a trial for Moses and the other people, and I don't think there's anything to say he wouldn't do that. I think that if God could use you for however he wants with his plan, and so if you refuse to believe in what God is saying, there's nothing to say that God still won't use you to perhaps test other Christians or test other good things in the world. So I think he might have been using Pharaoh to test Moses.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I haven't thought about that. I'll have to think about that some more. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Do you have Romans 9 on your list?
No.
It's Romans 9 and verse 17. It says, for the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." And then it says, "So that he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." So the answer to your question is, ultimately, God did what he did because in order for himself to receive glory.
Yeah, I mean, that's spot on, obviously. You're reading from Scripture, of course it's spot on. But I think I chose the two verses I did specifically because I think it calls out that same point. And I struggled with this a little bit a handful of years ago, and I think studying through it this time was the first time that it really became glaringly obvious to me what it says in Romans there. If we look back at these two verses that we read, starting in verse 10, the Lord said to Moses, "Go in to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, So, okay, God has hardened not just Pharaoh's heart, but the heart of all of Pharaoh's servants. And you're thinking to yourself, why? Why would God do that? He literally answers in the exact same verse. So therefore, I may show these signs of mine among them. Okay, so that's why God hardened their hearts, because he wants to perform these signs among them. And, so a second thing, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians and what signs I've done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. So there's kind of three things there. There's one, that I may show these signs of mine among them. So I'm going to do this miraculous thing and have victory over Pharaoh and over Egypt. And two, that you'll then repeat that victory amongst the generations. From generation to generation, I will be known by this incredible victory that I have over Pharaoh. And then the third thing, that you may know that I am the Lord. And I think that is awesome. Those are three really cool things that God is doing here. He's hardening these hearts so that he's going to achieve this great purpose that he has set forth in motion in the world, which is to get glory for God's people, for that glory to then spread to all the ends of the earth, and then finally that all the earth, those who hear that story, will know that Yahweh is God, that I am Yahweh. Like that is really cool to me. Exodus chapter 14, we see the same thing. Starting in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp between Migdol and the sea. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them." Why? And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Like those are his two purposes. He's going to harden their hearts, and they're going to pursue towards the Red Sea for two purposes. One, for God to achieve his own glory, and then two, this is specifically talking about the Egyptians, that they may know that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh. And I think that goes back to Jake's point, which is the whole purpose of the plagues, were to tear down this worldview that there are any other gods, that there are any other power other than God. And so he said, this is my final act, the act at the Red Sea, and it will show the Egyptians that I am Yahweh, that I am the only true and right God. And I think that's really, really cool. Any other thoughts here on why God hardened Pharaoh's heart?
A couple of things, because this is also something that's in the past been very difficult for me. The first thing is God gave Pharaoh so many chances. Like we don't see this verbiage kind of switch from Pharaoh hardened his heart to God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So I think probably about halfway through. So we see that there was plenty of opportunity for Pharaoh to make the right call on his own. But also, I think if Pharaoh had made the correct decision to let the Israelites go, we would not, it would have been so easy to give that credit to him. Obviously it still would have been God's divine intervention that made it happen, but it would have been so much easier to give that credit to Pharaoh where that credit wasn't really due. And also, I think this event becomes like part of an introduction that God uses for himself. Like we see later on with the Ten Commandments, God says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery." Like this is more than just, oh, I did this thing. Like this is an identifier of who God is. Like this is the thing that he wants the Israelites to think of when they think about him. Maybe that wouldn't have been the same if Pharaoh would have taken the first chance, or the second or the third.
Absolutely.
So, I think one of the reasons we struggle with this is we've got this idea that somehow this is unfair to Pharaoh. And I kind of think like she does, that Pharaoh had lots of chances to show that he was going to fear God and keep his commandments. Of course he didn't. But I don't know if this this helps you, it helps me in Romans, the first chapter, if we think about kind of a high-level outline of Romans chapter 1 is the sinning Gentiles, Romans chapter 2 is you Jews, you're no better, and Romans chapter 3 is for we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. But there, in talking about the sins of the Gentiles, and all of kind of the carnal sins that they were involved in Romans 1 and verse 28, Paul finally says, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind. So I don't know if it helps you, but it helps me to think of, okay, Pharaoh's already showed his colors, and God knows what kind of man he is and which way he's going to go. And so, like this brother also said, I'm going to use him to my glory then. This isn't a matter of free willing. He's made his choice, and so I'm going to go ahead and use him to my purpose. That's one thing I think of. The other thing I think of from Romans the 9th chapter where Ryan was reading from just a minute ago, another thing that's in there is it says, does the pot or does the clay pot have the right to ask the potter, why did you use me this way, or why did you make me this way? So it's almost as if Paul is saying, who are we, oh man, to even question God in that respect? And again, I think this is healthy, and I think we kind of want to understand. Well, didn't Pharaoh have free will? But at the end of the day, we are God's creation, and kind of as Ryan alluded to, we are made to glorify Him. And I think it's part and parcel for this country we're brought up in that teaches us to stand up for our rights. And so, and I think we bring that attitude to God. Hey, God, we've got our free will rights right here, and that's just wrong head. That's wrong head.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to try my best to recite this correctly because I did a study on Exodus, and I read some people who were refuting, who weren't Christians, saying, well, if you read in the Bible, like in Exodus, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and that's not fair because then Pharaoh couldn't decide to do the right thing, and so that's how some non-Christians will look at the Bible and be like, well then, is God really that good if He allowed Pharaoh and forced him to harden his heart? And this author and this Bible study refuted it by saying the language isn't saying that God forced Pharaoh to do the wrong thing. It's that God did not intervene and force him to do the right thing. And I thought that was really interesting to read because that is something I've struggled in the past with. Well, why would God harden his heart? But the thing is, it's just that God didn't soften his heart. He gave Pharaoh the choice to do wrong. God did not force him to do what was right, basically. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I think when we read some of these verses out of context, they can seem weird like that. But I think when you look at the entirety of the story, you see a story of someone who is fundamentally opposed to God, has a hard heart, who is utterly oppressing God's people. If we remember in the beginning, our first class, we're talking about how he's killing the Israelite babies and how this is just a horrible, oppressive situation. And God looks on his people and has compassion on them and says, I see this horrible situation, and I'm going to turn this whole situation into an event for my glory. And as was mentioned earlier, I'm going to turn this into my signet ring. This is the thing that when you think of Yahweh and you think of God, you're going to think of how I delivered my people out of Egypt. And I think when you think of it like that, it's not God forcing Pharaoh to do anything that he wasn't already very much doing and or inclined to do. But you see God turning this horrible situation into a beautiful event where people for all of time are now going to associate with God's great power, and as we read in the verses, know that he is the Lord because he delivered his people out of Egypt. I think that's awesome. I have a little bit more to say here. Let's look back. Let's look at our New Testament example to see something similar. Let's turn to John chapter 12. And whoever has that verse, just wait 1 second so we can all turn there and look at this together. John chapter 12. John chapter 12, verses 37 through 42.
Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore, they could not believe, for again Isaiah said, He has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I will heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting because once again, this idea of God hardening hearts is not necessarily exclusive with Pharaoh. It's something that was prophesied in Isaiah and we see coming to fruition with the life of Jesus. God has, in verse 40, blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand, which I think explains a lot, especially when we talked about the verse of the disciples and the walking on the water, where Jesus is being Jesus and performing these miracles. And as we know, with the Messianic secret, a lot of these things were hidden for a time. He talked in parables, and it was very confusing to those around him. His true glory and nature was revealed for a time while Jesus was on earth. Why? So that his purpose might be fulfilled, so that Christ might die on the cross and, give us salvation and life through his blood. And that wouldn't have happened if his true glory and nature would have been revealed from the very moment that he entered this earth. So I think that's a really interesting thing. We don't need to talk too much more about this, but I think ultimately when we're trying to answer the question, why does God harden someone's heart? It's always to achieve his purpose and to achieve his will. And if we think about it like that, it's not something that we're going to struggle with. Last point I want to make is sometimes, oh no, I have more, sorry. I forgot about that. This point, do I have time for it? No, I don't think I have time for it. We're going to skip this point. The last thing I want to talk about is how sometimes we choose to harden our own hearts today. So I want to kind of take it all the way to us today and talk about a modern application. Let's turn to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 3. This is a little bit of a longer section, so I broke it up into 3 sections. So someone has Hebrews chapter 3, 1 through 6. Someone has verses 7 through 11, and someone should have verses 12 through 19. Let's start in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, and let's read through all 3 of those sections.
Therefore, holy brothers, you who shared a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle, high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as his son, and we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope.
So as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion during the times of testing in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested and tried me. Through the 40 years they saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath my anger, they shall never enter my rest.
Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil
thank you to all those that read those verses there. I love this passage, and I really want to make sure that we got to it because I think it's really powerful. Because we see it starting off, and there's this comparison between Moses and Jesus. And the heading in my Bible above chapter 3 says, Jesus greater than Moses. And I think, obviously that's maybe, basic to some of us. So, of course, Jesus is greater than Moses. But that was a big deal to these first century Christians who held up Moses in the absolute highest self-esteem. And so there's this talk about the builder of the house versus the house itself. And the whole point there is that Jesus is so much greater than Moses. And then the Hebrew writer turns and talks about you and I, and he gives a very clear warning. It says, those back in Moses' day hardened their hearts, and they were not able to enter the rest. And it's a parallel today. It says, now don't you be like them and harden your hearts, or you will not be able to enter the rest. And if you look about the parallel, if Jesus is so much greater than Moses, the rest that we have coming is going to be much greater with Jesus than it was with Moses. So there's a very clear warning. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And a very clear consequence, if you do that, you or they shall not enter my rest. And so we shouldn't harden our hearts today. We shouldn't be like these people that we've read about where we're, having a rock as a heart. We should be feeling compassionate. We should live like Jesus and have humility like we've talked about so much tonight. But I think there's also something to point out here. What hardens our hearts today? I think there's an answer in Scripture, so I am looking for a specific answer. Does someone see it? Ian?
What hardens our hearts today is like, we want to do our own thing, we don't want to help other people, but God says to be, what is that word I'm looking for? What Jesus was. Jesus was sorry, I forgot. A servant. And we're supposed to serve other people, not serve ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of hit it on the head, but I think it's articulated really clearly in verse 13, which says, exhort one another every day as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So it's a very simple conclusion at the end of this class, which is like, avoid sin. Okay, great, we're all Christians, we kind of get that. But if you kind of play out this theme that started in Exodus, or really started in Genesis, but is really prominent in Exodus and prominent in the life of Moses, continues through the Gospels, and then we're called out today, which is if you give in to sin and temptation, your hearts are going to be hardened, you're not going to live like Jesus, and because of that, you're not going to be able to enter his rest. And that's something that we see throughout the Bible, and it's really prominent at the end here. So if anyone has any final takeaways, the thing I was thinking of is, how can we prevent our hearts from becoming hard? How could we not be like Pharaoh and not be like those with hard hearts, not be like the Pharisees?
Because I'd say that success, which can be good, but success in pride or parallel, can run into that, which can harden the heart.
Any other thoughts? How can we,
I'm just thinking about being a stay-at-home mom. It's easy to just get frustrated with your kids and snap at them or lose
So
your
easy.
temper. You don't even know yet. I'm just gonna say, but it's just I follow this one mom, that Christian mom, and she always, I love her reminders because she always says, even if you vent to a friend about how frustrated your kids were that day or something, don't let their comfort keep you from asking forgiveness later that day because you still sin when you were unkind to your kids or when you lost your temper or when you were impatient with them or when you, which as a mom you can be too prideful at times too. I mean, there's just a lot of mistakes that I feel like you can just see really easily in yourself. And it's just, it's so nice to read what she says because I always think, right, like don't think that when I lash out at my kids, it's just, I'm tired and I get an excuse for that. It's wrong and I should try hard not to do that anymore. And it just seems sobering too when we read this scripture that way. If I put in my mind, I'm actually provoking God. I feel like I don't really think of it that way the same, but I'm actually poking and prodding like my kids do to me whenever
I love that. So our 10-cent takeaway for the night. Moses was surrounded by people with hard hearts, both Pharaoh but also the people in the wilderness. Yet he followed God's instructions faithfully and laid the foundation for God's will to be done. Let's do likewise. Thank you all.